Well, thank you, Corinna. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here. In advance, I want to say that I more or less speak English, but I think I will have some problems at some point. So I hope you be not too harsh. If something sounds very strange, if I'm not pronouncing things correctly or explaining things confusely, please feel free to stop me and or correct me or ask, because I can speak English, but I'm not very used to speak. I have not many opportunities to speak English, so I will do my best and deliver this presentation generally. Yeah, as Corinna said, we published here a compilation actually of Ilyenkov's texts here in Peru. It was a dialectics of the ideal, the cosmology of spirit, and also a text. I don't know what's its original name in English. It's the school in literally translated into Spanish. It's called "The School Should Teach How to Learn." I think that's the literal translation. I think the translation in English, the title will be different. Well, in this year, which is the center, the point of my presentation, I published a book here in Peru, which has actually the same title as the article I wrote for Marxism and Science, which is called well, in Spanish, El Animal Universal, which is the universal animal. It looks a little bit, some friends always told me it looks more like a theological book than a philosophy book or anthropology book. And the subtitle is Reconstruction of the Dialectics of the First and Second Nature. So it is an attempt, the book, to rethink the relation between human societies and the ecological environment. And the starting point for this book are different, you could say, philosophical theories, very prominent in Amazonian anthropology, represented by Philippe Descola, who's a French philosopher who studied with Claude Lévi-Strauss, who also studied or made the Amazon basin the center of its studies for some time. And Philippe Descola, he studied first the Achua people in Ecuador, which live in Ecuador in the frontier with Peru. And the other anthropologist, but who developed his own philosophical theory, is Eduardo Viveiro de Castro, who published a book very famous, at least in anthropology, but also I think outside anthropology, which is called Cannibalistic Metaphysics. And the book by Philippe Descola is called Beyond Nature and Culture. And both, there are differences. They are both part of a movement, let's say, theoretical movement in anthropology, which is called the ontological turn, which is a form of anthropology to rethink the different cultures of the world as some kind of ontologies, or in the case of Viveiro de Castro, metaphysics. So that's also why Descola named his book Beyond Nature and Culture. So the intent is to comprehend culture, different cultures, Amazon cultures, and every cultures in general, in terms of their own concepts, not as perhaps as traditionally in anthropology, you look first, what are the ecological conditions in which these societies live, and then we try to understand their cosmologies and their cultural organization as an adaptation to this ecosystem, which is perhaps also a point of view which I try to recover, which is generally speaking also a very materialistic or Marxist point of view, but they try, inspired by the philosophy of Kant, in the case of Philippe Descola, in Deleuze, in the case of Eduardo Viveiro Castro, rethink these societies not as adaptations to an ecosystem, but as metaphysics in their own rights. So it is not an adaptation, it is culture is, or you can say, explain the system of these ideas based on the ideas itself. Not as, because they say it would be how you call it? It's part of the modern narcissism that we try to reconstruct these societies in terms of adaptation to culture, because this would point us, the moderns, in like in the how you call it, in the forefront of human evolution, and they're somehow like how it's called, less developed societies. So in the book, I have to try to make the point that I recover the point that cultures are indeed systems of thoughts which help societies or human groups to adapt to certain ecological circumstances. And at the same point, I have a very important aspect of the book is to show that that does not lead us necessarily to a conception where the West is the ultimate ontological and cultural goal to which all cultures should aspire. This is, let's say, like a political tension which is in there. I think I go perhaps, I don't know who it is. It's just, his name is S. He said, so it's pure idealism. That's interesting because David Graeber, I don't know if you know, it's a very popular anthropologist. He wrote an answer and a revision of the theories of Eduardo Viveiro Castro. And Graeber said in his phrase literally is something like, it's not only idealism, it's the idealism in its most extravagant form. It's very extreme idealism.
Yeah, it was me, by the way, Martin, Sasha.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. No, of course, as Ralph said, it's kind of obvious, but it's at the same time very surprising to find this extreme case. So it's good that you brought the quote, because I think it's really extreme, and only for reasons which lie actually outside metaphysical realm, let's say, yeah, for the sake of I don't know, anti-Eurocentrism. Yeah, but all the more your proposal seems to be interesting.
Just two moderation comments. So first, it would be better if we make sure that Martin has his 30 minutes, although that was an interesting intervention by Sasha. I think it would be good if we allow Martin to finish and then ask for questions. Second of all, Martin, did you say that you wanted us to be looking at a PDF? Because we don't see anything right now, so you do need to share.
Yes, I just wanted to show it. It's like,
yeah.
Okay, I will now share. So you can tell me if you see it. Yes.
It should work in a second. You just, oh, there we go. Oh no, it disappeared again. Did you close it? We saw it for a moment and then you must have clicked stop or something.
Yeah, just.
Yeah, if you do the exact same thing again.
Share, maybe we have to share. Oh, it's coming.
You see it now?
Something's coming.
Yeah, it'll appear. There we go. Okay, thanks.
Oh,
yeah, we see it now. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So in the book, I'm trying. It's not, the book is not somehow. I did also to start to justify myself before Ilyenkovian audience. It is not like I develop a specifically Ilyenkovian theory, but Ilyenkov has been very central to my own development, my own ideas. And first of all, I want to, the book starts also with rethinking the Amazonian societies and their ideological systems, their cosmologies, based on what Ilyenkov develops in the dialectics of the ideal, as which is an idea taken from Marx, the vital activity. Vital activity is the societal, the social circumstances which combines modes of production, but also the ideological justification of all this. And when we see the Amazon basin, we see an extraordinary cultural diversity, which at first glance could suggest that there is that's just pure diffuse distinction between cultures. But all these different cultures, all these hundreds of different languages, forms of adorning themselves, different cultures, they have or they share a cultural logic, like a matrix, which is evenly distributed in all the Amazon basin. First of all, they have a mode of production. They have a demographic dispersion in small units. They are semi-nomadic. They have small substance agriculture, mainly yucca. Yucca is manioc. It's like a big potato, which is the basis of the nutrition system in the Amazon. Corn, bananas, etc., which are very small agriculture. And then there are hunters, gatherers, and they fish. So this is more or less the production, the mode of production, let's say. This is shared by all the societies. And also, perhaps more surprising point, which they all share, are their ideological perspectives. There is, like Levi-Strauss points out, there dominates a form of thinking which Levi-Strauss calls science of the concrete. There are no macro categories. So this means that all the living things, all the animals and all the plants are named with special names. There are no macro categories, as for example, mammals or something like that. They have no concepts of a higher level of abstraction. So they name everything name by name. It's not like we have like different classes or categories. And also all Amazon societies are more or less in higher or lesser degree animists, which means that they attribute human personality traits to animals. Animals, sometimes plants also, but primarily animals. So if we see it like that, we could at the first moment say, well, that has to do something with the ecological circumstances. If all Amazon societies are animists, that has probably something to do with the ecological circumstances. Because if you go, for example, where I worked the last 10 years, which is the central jungle of Peru, it is like 3 hours. You go to the Andes and there's no animism. So it's in all the Andean spaces you have no animism, and you go like 100 kilometers to the east, and then all societies start being animists. So you could say it has to do something with the ecological circumstances. And then perhaps we have to make us clear what are the ecological circumstances of the Amazon ecology. First of all, we have ancient, poor, and very clay soils. This explains, sorry if I'm jumping like that, this small subsistence agriculture. You cannot develop a big, intensive, large-scale agriculture because, as you see here in the slices, if you cut the trees, then in the Amazon, because of there is so much insects on the soil is devoured very rapidly. It's not like the European forest where you have thick layers of humus. You have a very small layer of humus. You cut the trees, and you have two ecological factors which are very strong, which is the strong sun, which denaturalizes micronutrients, and you have the strong rains. So after just 1 year, perhaps, the soil is absolutely useless. This is why, for example, Amazonian societies also, as I put here, are semi-nomadic. It's a term which is not very precise, but which explains that they move to a certain area, and in 10, 15 years, more or less, they have exhausted the resources of the area. So they go like 50 kilometers in another direction. Not semi-nomadic as tribes which are constantly in movement, but they have to move after certain time. So then you have fruits which are very low in protein and only stationary availability. So you see, we have like an image of the Amazon, which is a space of abundance. You put out your arm, you already have a coconut and a banana and some. It's totally different. You have very small, very little fruits available, only in certain in only perhaps a month. Different. It depends on the plant. And then the fauna, we have also relatively small animals. The biggest animal we have in the Amazon is the, how you call it in English, tapir, which is, well, it's relatively big, but it's really a small animal compared to the big animals you have, for example, the bisons in North America, or the cows, or other big animals in other continents. And with the exception of some monkeys and some animals that are very small, they are all loner. They go through the territory alone. A tapir is not going in a group. So you have, as a consequence, the protein which is needed for these societies to survive. You have these in very small, very little packages, very small animals, and these are dispersed in very big territories. That is why we have these small indigenous groups in all the Amazon. We have never a big urban society in the Amazon, only very small groups, because they cannot make an intensive agriculture, and they have to leave intact big forest areas so that the animals can reproduce there and that they can hunt them. So, and this is also a different problem, is that there are no animals suitable for domestication. So you cannot create or have a big control over the different phenomena of the ecosystem. Betty Meggers called this the ecological limitations for human development in the Amazon. Donald LaTrappe, which was an American anthropologist, called this the tropical forest culture. Amazonian development is a fight between Barcia and firmland, which has had two different ecosystems, which is not very a fight for rich and poor ecosystems, but really between a poor and the poorer ecosystem. The Varsia are these areas which are flooded every year by the big rivers, so they are slightly more productive, but still. There's a saying also which is totally contra-intuitive, because we think of the Amazon as a place of abundance. Amazon is also known sometimes as the green desert or the protein desert. So, taken into account these characteristics, ecological characteristics, what says Descola about the ecosystem and the probability that these animistic cosmologies are the result of these ecological characteristics? He says that the Amazon is characterized by Descola, by a tremendous diversity of life forms that rarely occur in homogeneous assemblages. In an environment as diverse as the Amazon rainforest, it was probably inevitable that the perception of relationships between apparently very different individuals gained the upper hand over the construction of stable and mutually exclusive macro categories. So why are there no macro categories? Well, because the animals are so diverse, so different, they never occur in big groups. So it's just so confusing for the human mind that they just have to name every single animal for itself. And so he states also, it is therefore unlikely that these features of thinking, animism, are due to adaptation to a particular ecosystem, which, because of its inherent properties, has provided the analogous model for thinking about the organization of the world. And his main argument is that such interpretation is the existence of very similar cosmologies elaborated by peoples living in an entirely different environment, more than 6,000 kilometers north to the Amazon. And he references here the people of the First Nations in the north of the United States and Canada and Siberia and Canada are animists. So this is, and also they are very similar. It's surprisingly similar animism. You have, for example, in the Amazon, you have this figure which is the landlord, you could probably say. He's the owner of the animals. So when, for example, the shaman makes a session, taking ayahuasca, for example, he gets in contact with this owner of the animals, and he negotiates with the owner of the animals that please, he will let the people hunt more animal because they are so hungry, they are in need, etc., etc. So the animals of the forest are conceived as the animals of this owner. He's the owner. So you have to negotiate with him in order to have good luck, good hunting luck. And exactly the same figure is present in the animism in Siberia, Korea. You have also this owner of the animals. You have to, in Siberia, it is not ayahuasca. It is, I think, mushrooms and things like that. You also make these sessions on it. So the shaman is supposed to go up into a pure spiritual sphere where he then can negotiate with this owner of the animals the good hunting luck. So we could ask, and I think here for me was Ilyenkov very, very important because he develops a vision of the society and vision of the vital activity, which allows us to not fall into the trap of conceiving the human mind as I call it in the book as a passive meditating mind, but an active mind. The human mind enters into mutual interactions with the phenomenon of the world, and it is in this interaction that it creates ideas. It is not like the human mind is just we are, as perhaps we conceive it sometimes. No, the biologist goes into the forest and just looks at the animals. We're not just looking at the environment. We engage with the environment. And when we take this engagement, this work, labor, human labor, as the center of our anthropology, we can perhaps or counter this at first glance very intuitive point of Descola, who says, well, the Amazon is totally different as the boreal forest. And at first glance, yeah, that's true, because you have the Amazon, you have plants, you have animals, you have biodiversity unmatched in any other ecosystem. And then you go to the boreal forest, you have very little animals, very little plants. It is like the white desert, sometimes called. And so, but if we start from a point of the vital activity, and we can say that they are really not that different. For example, the fauna. They are bigger animals, but they are not present throughout the whole year. So there is not like a constant protein resource. Flora is the same thing. We have little eatable fruits and only present during few months. The climate is extremely cold. The winters are extremely long, and the summers are very short, which means that they can also not engage in intensive agriculture. They are like the Amazon people, forced to make a very small agriculture and only doing very few moments. Well, aquí, here it should say conditions of the soil. I put it in Spanish, sorry. The boreal forest is, I take here a quote from Hollowell, who was an anthropologist who studied the nations, the First Nations of Canada. The boreal forest is a region basically unsuitable for agriculture, so much that for a long time it was physical barrier to national development and the unification of Canada. So this forces also these human societies to organize in small, like dispersed settlements, and also semi-nomadically change periodically their location. So you can say that is the Arctic very really that different from the Amazon? The mind is not primordially orientated toward contemplation, but effective intervention in the environment. And from this point of view, the Arctic and the Amazon result very similar. First of all, the science of the concrete is I developed this in the book, is consequences that more abstract macro categories as mammals, as birds, or things like that, they are just not suitable for hunting behavior. They are not very effective because every animal in the Amazon and also in the Arctic, they have very different, how do you call it, activity patterns. So if you create an abstraction, a class of its own, this will not help you in your hunting activity. So you need really address every animal one by one, because every animal one by one has a different activity pattern. It would not help you to create these macro categories, and that's the same in the Amazon and in the Arctic. And animism is also clearly an auxiliary device for intervene communicatively in the environment where concrete interventions are impossible. So you ask the owner of the forest to give you what you in real material conditions cannot achieve. You cannot achieve more hunting game. You cannot achieve domestication of the animals. So you are condemned to certain passivity in front of the ecological conditions. So they try throughout communication better their situation, which they are not able to do in concrete terms. So from a biological standpoint, obviously the Amazon and the Arctic are fundamentally different, but from a human vital activity point, they are not. They're very much the same. We have the white desert or the green desert, and we have a relative subordination to the productive dynamics of animals and plants. Humans have to subordinate themselves to the ecological dynamics. And the consequence of this is obviously that you conceive yourself. It's not an abstract ethics, as for example, Descola or Viveiros try to demonstrate, that they are taking this point of view out of an ecological reflection, that they are engaged in ethically horizontal relations with other animals because they are ethically so much better than we are, because we are so narcissistic and we want to dominate the nature, and they don't want to do it. They establish like these horizontal friendly relations with the animals. It's the other way around. They cannot do it. And if you engage with an environment where you, not abstractly, but really in real life, you have to accommodate to the dynamics and the forces of other animals and plants, you will conceive yourself as one of many others who are equal to you, because you are really equal in productive terms. You cannot impose yourself on these other on these other phenomena. Viveiros is perhaps, he takes everything a step further, where Descola is still trying, let's say, to work into the realm of anthropology and science. Viveiros really is already with one leg into esotericism, well, he describes the cosmologies as metaphysics. They are cannibalistic because social interactions with various animals allow their agency to be overwhelmed. So you establish social relations with other animals because that allows you to get them to know better, and that allows you ultimately to hunt them better. So it's like you are really tricking them. This is why the animals that people want to hunt participate in animistic social networks. So the question is, are animistics or perspectivistics cosmology metaphysics? And I work here with I got inspiration here also by Lenkov, but also by I read a text which very interesting by Peter Ruben, who is a German Marxist philosopher, and he also develops that human labor, where we interact and transform the phenomena of the ecosystem, presupposes or forces us to establish a relation of observation with the objects. Yeah, we have to conceive the object independently of ourselves. This is why we have to create abstractions. And therefore, and finally, because we create abstractions, talking in Hegelian terms, we create concepts of now I don't know the word in English, Verstand, yeah, rational concepts. We then need philosophy, concepts of understanding. We then need concepts of rationality, which is the concretization of philosophy. But Amazonian societies do not have a transformative effect on the ecosystem. That is why their own vital activity is perceived as a kind of interplay with the forces of nature, in which humans are only one of many equal participants. And where human societies interact directly with the forces of nature, there is no conceptual distinction from nature. That is why their concepts are not scientific concepts, and that is why they don't need metaphysics or philosophy. So this is what I try to establish in the second chapter of my book. And I said, where abstraction does not create a distinction, there is no need for concretizing philosophy. So these two anthropologists, but who elevate their anthropological work to somehow philosophy, ecological philosophy, is the main aim of the work to develop an alternative point of view, from a dialectical point of view, reconceive these cosmologies as a natural outcome of the ecological conditions in which these societies live. It is, we can very well derive the ideological systems, the animistic systems, from the ecological conditions. So I then also work on this scheme from, or this, I took it from Marshall Salins. Marshall Salins is an American anthropologist, slightly inspired by Marx, although I think he has a confusing standpoint on Marx, but he also reviewed Descolat's work, and Descolat describes 4 different conceptions of the world, which is animism, totemism, analogism, and naturalism. Animism is where I project human personality traits to animals, which is in the Amazon, for example, or in Siberia. Totemism we have primarily in Australia, which is like a double movement. It's like I call it where we are in the mirror. We project personality traits to animals, but also animal traits to humans. So if you in a totemistic society, you are part of, I don't know, the clan of the dingo. So human conceive that you really have kind of physical similarities with a dingo and things like that. So you project not only humanity too, but also animal natural conditions into the society. And analogism is where you have like hierarchical and organized totemistic and animistic traits. It's like a mixture. And finally, he says we have naturalism. This is also a point of Descola. Naturalism represents the modern Western thought. So in spite of saying these are 4 different ways of conceiving nature, Salin says, and he's right in that we have a clear pattern here, that animism is the strongest form of personhood, of anthropomorphism of personhood. Totemism is a little bit less because it's not general. You distribute these personhood conditions to different groups. Analogism less, and naturalism, which is the Western modern thinking, is totally free of personhood. We don't attribute personhood or anthropomorphistic motives to different phenomena. And I think he has a point, but I think at the same time he is. I will go with why I think that Salins is also wrong in some way, but he's right. And what I developed in this book, I try to establish it that the reason why animism has the biggest amount of personhood is because animistic societies are societies that have the less impact, transformative impact in their ecosystem. And where you have to subordinate to the forces of the ecosystem, you conceive really the environment as equal to you, the forces of the environment. Totemistic societies are always bigger societies. They are bigger and have a bigger transformative impact on their ecosystem. And analogism is present. For example, we could say analogistic societies are, for example, all the Mesopotamian societies, Egypt, the societies of the medieval were also analogistic in a sense. And you have this where societies get a bigger impact, transformative impact on the environment. So it should not come as a surprise that naturalism or the Western modernity, the capitalistic societies, which has now inaugurated the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, where we practically have transformed all the ecosystems of the world in an anthropogenic way. We are totally free of personhood. So if you control the forces of the nature, you don't project any person or human traits on it. You just control it. So this is the point I developed in the first 2 chapters also, that the counter movement to personhood, which Salins describes here, is the anthropogenic transformation of environment. The more the societies interact and engage and transform the ecosystem, the less they conceive the ecosystem as spiritual. It gets disenchanted in some way. So this brings me to the last point. There are obviously many points in the book. I have to run a bit through it. But in the last chapter, the 4th chapter, I try to also correct somehow Salin's point here. So he says naturalism is the ontology of Western modernity or something like that. And this is the first thing. It is no coincidence, which I said, that well, we have Western modernity, which ushered in the Anthropocene or Capitalocene, where all the world's ecosystem become anthropogenic. There is no direct anthropomorphism or personhood. But second of all, it is naturalism is not the ontology of Western modernity. I think this is just from a philosophical standpoint, a very false conception. Capitalism reproduces itself throughout a fragmented society, and in a fragmented society, it is not possible to produce a unified ontology. I also developed this when I criticize Descola. He also calls about the naturalism of the Western modernity, where we don't attribute, where we see absolutely no similarity and interiority with other animals, and just a materialistic continuity. And this is just such an extreme simplification where, for example, the difference in our conceptions between idealism or materialism, for once, for Descola has no meaning at all. We are all naturalists, and we are not all naturalists. There is no unified ontology of the West. This is it is totally a simplification. And what I try now to develop in the fourth chapter is I make like in how you call it. I try to recapitulate more or less some important points of the history of the Western thinking tradition, starting with the Greeks, going then to the Romans, the medieval, a pretty classic timeline. But what I want to show is when looking at various political and scientific theories, it is striking that anthropomorphic elements are indeed present. Socially produced circumstances are naturalized and absolutized. So I don't think that, as Salins points it here, that naturalism has no personhood at all. We still have personhood, and to a high degree, just that the attribution of personhood, this animistic spirit, say it in somehow, is very much present in our modern thinking, only that the anthropomorphistic projection develops itself on a higher abstract level, so that it is not immediately visual or conceivable for us. And I make some example. I start with Plotin, who, for example, is his whole philosophical construct is obviously a derivation from the Roman Empire. It has exactly the same structure. Or, for example, I put examples as I draw here very strong on Boris Hessen, who is a Soviet historian of philosophy. For example, the modern turn by Descartes, conceiving nature as a machine, which is also inspired by the social historical circumstances of its time. So this is also a kind of anthropomorphism, because I judge socially produced circumstances and then project them to the natural world and claim that the world is like that. Or, for example, by Hobbes, Leviathan, no, that Homo homini lupus, no, every man is a wolf to other people, no, his claim, which is perhaps true in the times of Hobbes, because he lives throughout the civil war in England, but he then absolutizes the human condition he observes in the circumstances and then naturalizes it and projects it into nature and says humans always have been like that. And humans have not always been wolves to other humans. You know, it's a kind of personhood or anthropomorphistic motive that is very well present in different social in different theories, scientific theories, philosophical theories. I also mentioned The Origin of Species by Darwin. This is mentioned often, that this is also some kind of anthropomorphistic motive. He obviously projects the reality of the Manchester capitalist societies to the world in general. And I also develop it with the theories of sociobiology, which also have been accused many times. It's not a novel point of mine, that they judge human behavior, which is produced by capitalistic circumstances, and then projected to the human nature, and stating it is like that. It has always been like that. And in some kind, this is also an anthropomorphistic motive. So this is what I said at the beginning. I try to demonstrate in this last chapter that we are in no way in a position where we could say, as it is sometimes pointed out by Descola or Viveiros, that we could, from our high standpoint of the West, say, mock the Amazonian societies, like saying, look at them, the superstitious things they're believing in. They're believing that the jaguar has a human personality. That's totally ridiculous. We are in no way in a position like that, because also in the West, in our modern thinking, modern scientific thinking, we have a whole lot of anthropomorphistic motives which don't appear as them directly to us. But I think this is a motive which is intrinsic to dialectical thinking, and which is which accompanies us till today. Well, this is the presentation, more or less, of my book, and I see there are already plenty of questions.
Thank you very much, Martin. So, yeah, that was fascinating. Definitely a new area for us. So we won't spend time reading the chat. The chat is separate, so I'm not taking comments from the chat. Just before we open up to questions, it would be great to hear from people we don't usually hear from, especially if you're here from the for the first time. So yeah, we'll come to Dr. Taremas in a second. So we did have a session earlier, a few sessions ago, about connecting Ilyenkov to science and technology studies. And there, Andrei Novak, who might want to say something soon, was suggesting that it's helpful to connect Ilyenkov to Latour, because you're kind of emphasizing things. You're kind of actually analyzing the stuff that's actually there. You're sort of materially doing that. But I guess the question I have, because the close connection between Latour and a figure that you mentioned earlier, who's a big influence in anthropology, Deleuze, is this modern animism. So lots of people now want to read everything as having an agency, as being vibrant. So yeah, just as a very broad thing, to start us off before we get into more technical things, what's the difference between like vibrant matter and focusing on life activity, and why do you think there's such a popularity for animism now? Why is it so popular to talk about everything as alive and its own agent and things like that?
Yeah, I think the ultimate motivation for that is that we live in strange world, in city. There, I think this is in the book I make a parallel between something that Lukács is developing. He writes that in the how do you call it in English, the reason, the attack on reason. Is that the title in English? Attack on
Oh,
reason by
yeah,
Destroy of the reason.
destruction of reason.
Destruction of reason. And he says also that there were tendencies in German philosophy of the late 19th century to project many things into the medieval. So medieval philosophy was very popular in the sense that you could, or medieval societies were conceived as somehow more organic societies, which are like in a natural equilibrium with the environmental forces, and also social stability, where everything has his right point, his right place. And I think it's similar nowadays with animism. So we live in the cities, we are disenchanted in this city life, alienated life. So I think it's very much an intent to search refuge in these societies, encountering in them more organic societies, which obviously, and this is something very, very strong here in Peru, that they are suggested that we could inspire ourselves in reconstructing our own ethical ethical systems, orientating us in animism, primarily with the in how you call it, in front with climate change. That would be perhaps a reasonable way to reconnect with nature. And I think I think most of it is esotericism. Esotericism, you call it esotericism. But I think it's a natural instinct perhaps to do that. But that's also something I want to point out in the book, that it's absolutely not possible for us. This animism which is promoted, we cannot conceive. This is a very important point. The indigenous of the Amazon, they don't project artificially personhood into the animals. They really conceive them as equal. It is not like that they're projecting, but we, from a modern point of view, we would totally abstractly project humanity into animals. And I sometimes ask myself, do the people really believe that? You don't really believe that you can communicate with a jaguar. That is just like a belief you want to have, but you cannot really believe that.
Great,
Well,
thank you. Great, and Teremes?
Hi. First of all, I'd like to thank you for this inspiring lecture. I'd like to raise two questions concerning the idea of lack of macro categories in the thought. And later, I will make, if I have the time, some critical remarks. Just having read not the book, but the paper that was that circulated. Now, my question, the first question concerns, when you say that they give names to animals, do you refer to single animals or to kinds of animals? In other words, as far as the potatoes that they eat, do they name each potato separately from each other potato? Or do just they give a name to the potato they cultivate and distinguish it from other fruits, let's say, that they may also consume? Because the idea of a kind is a category, it's a macro category actually. Okay. And my second question draws from an anthropologist, Marvin Harris, who has introduced the distinction between emic and ethic. In other words, the conceptions that people use to self-understand their environment and their own society operate somehow on a kind of conscious level. But there is another unconscious level on the basis of which there exist macrocategories without they themselves knowing that they operate with such categories. Let me give you some examples. Tell me if they can be applied. For example, the distinction between edible food and non-edible food. Do they eat everything? Or do they distinguish in their ecosystem what kind of foods they could be edible and which are not? And this means that they have a kind of macro category in their categorical framework, in their unconscious categorical framework. Or, for example, the difference between the sexes. Do they distinguish between men and women? Or do they distinguish between ages? From my anthropological readings, I know that they do distinguish. These are macro categories, okay? Children, adults, old men. And just to take also an example from what you mentioned, they appeal, they invoke, or rather they placate the owner of the forest, the owner of the animals. So it means that they have the category of ownership as a macro category, their whole conceptual categorical framework, even though they may not know that perhaps this could apply also to other kind of items. And my last question relevant to that, especially concerning the animistic society, do they attribute animistic characteristics to the instruments of production that they use also? So in other words, is there a kind of quasi-secularism in distinguishing it from the animal and plant realms which they name, which means that they have a kind of macro category in making this kind of internal distinction between the usability of instruments through which they produce their goods and things like that. So these are my questions. Thank you.
Yes, for make it a little bit more simple here, as just stated, they have no macro categories. They have macro categories, but they're very small, very little of them. That's why there are some macro categories, which I think here Claude Lévi-Strauss is right. He identified like universal macro categories, but not, I mean, edible, not edible, hot, cold, male, female, cooked, raw. In all these macro categories, they are there. There are also micro categories, for example, animals. But that is very interesting, perhaps from an Ilyenkov point of view, because they are practically activity-centered categories. You have, for example, we have mammals, we have birds, we have fish. They have different categories. For example, they create some kind of macro categories which are suitable totally for them to for their hunting behavior, because we have animals that crawl, for example. So, for example, I don't know the name. One moment, I will find a lizard and a rat can go in the same category because they are animals that crawl over the soil. Then they are flying animals which go in the same category. For example, a bat and a bird, they go in the same category. So there are some kind of categories, but there are very few of them. They are not very developed. So there is not a big system as we have. I think the image is very suitable where we say we create these cathedrals of macro categories. They have macro categories that they're not very sophisticated, not very elaborated, but still they are, of course. Yeah, they are, of course. And which is interesting, which I also make emphasis in this in the book, that, as I just stated, you can see how these categories are constructed in function of the vital activity of the society. So these are macrocategories that are suitable for people who want to hunt. For example, there are also categories between animals that you can hunt with a arrow, and which you can hunt with traps. It's also macro category, but it's a macro category which is functional. But there are very much macro categories which are absent, and that is just because it's not suitable for their lifespan. So yeah, there are macro categories. Just for simplification, I said there are some, but not many. And for the majority of the animals that just go in these categories, but the majority, they got their own names, not animal for animal, but they have a name. Like this is a tapir, this is this monkey, this kind of monkey. But for example, they have no category for monkeys. But they all go in the big category with animals that live in the tree, for example.
They use a classificator system like the one Borges has introduced.
Yeah, I don't know the Borges system, but
taking a detail, let's say, an insignificant detail, and categorizing objects, let's say, that serve this detail without that being part of their essence.
Yeah, that's also something. They make associations with sometimes also seem very strange to us, but are very intuitive if you objectify the world from a hunter point of view. Yes, and in emic ethic, I don't know if I conceive this question right, but I think the problem of, and that's also a very important point that I stress in my book, I'm not questioning the anthropological work of Descola or Viveiros. I don't think they describe in a wrong way what these societies really are doing, or perhaps how they're thinking. But what they're trying to do is transform the cosmologies of these societies in a suitable philosophy for us in the modern. And this is here where the contradictions begin. So, and they try, and this is also a very curious thing, they try to describe the Amazon societies from an emic point of view. So they say we can actually connect or get to know the concepts of these indigenous societies, and we then can think literally like them. And I think that's the total fantasy. This is just not possible. We can understand how they think, but we cannot think like them. So that's what I said also to Kirill. We cannot become animists. That's a total illusion.
Okay. But what is your personal point of view? Do you accept the idea that, because you use in your paper the term reflexively, that they have a kind of reflexivity in their cultural makeup? And second, you use the term also self-consciousness. So do you believe that they are self-consciously also of the hidden categories, if you like, macro categories that they employ, or is there this kind of dimension that in a sense is true for almost any kind of society, given that we still live in the period of prehistory? Okay. In other words, this ideological element, the ideological distortions that exist in the way we perceive phenomenality and experience. In other words, do you believe, in other words, that they have a kind of transparency? Because this is a religious system. Animism is a religious system. If you read Durkheim, for example, Durkheim, he says, he's talking about the elementary forms of religious life. And there is this kind, the projection, remember the criticism of Marx drawn from Feuerbach, that in religion we have this tendency of anthropomorphizing the superior or transcendent being and projecting human characteristics. We have something like that here, projection of human characteristics onto nature. So this is a religious mythological structure, ideology in other words. So we should be careful to use the idea of reflexive self-understanding and self-consciousness in evaluating the type of culture that these societies have.
Yeah, I personally think there is perhaps some level of self-reflection, but I would say these are not, in anthropology, Fraser, I think he makes the distinction that they are not really religious systems, because in order to religion to exist, you have to make the distinction between the sacred and the profane. Profane, is this what you say? But I draw here very much on Marcel Mauss, who also describes these societies as a total social fact. There is no supernatural and natural world. Everything is supernatural. There is no just natural things. Everything is enchanted. I can engage with every animal. So I don't think, therefore, also this is a very consciousness created or self-reflective religious system, but rather an intuitive form of engaging with the environment. So I would say there is not really, if I understand it good, there is no, I think it is for the animistic societies themselves, they don't conceive themselves as animistic. So they don't reflect on their own. This is just their natural way of conceiving the world.
Okay, so we want to make sure that we have opportunities for others to join the discussion. So Andre, then Karina, and then we'll have time for someone else if you're preparing your question.
Okay. Do you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Martin, for your article and book. And I really love it because I have a very kind of long history of kind of being angry about this, let's say, Amazonian ontologies, because they are not Amazonian. And I have a few questions. First, is this a kind of a old problem with this, that contemporary anthropology just lost history? Yes, that those, let's say, the ontological turn is somehow, even if I am really STS, ANT, Latour guy, or whatever, but I see how they lost history. Yes, they really lost history. For example, when we have this famous or infamous article of Latour about going to Boa Vista, he's just starting the article in the middle of nowhere. And then, we know that this Boa Vista is big city constructed by, history of colonialism and so on, so on. And Latour is completely ignoring this. And for example, this is my question, is to what extent animism is not something, let's say, archaic or prehistoric or pre-modern, but just as much modern as different cosmologies. Because as I know, because I never have been in Amazonia, yes, but to at least as I know something about, reading, a lot of this, let's say, people of natives of Amazonia, they are co-product of colonialism. Yes, they are co-product of being pushed out from the more, from some areas to the forest. I sometimes use this category that they are post-apocalyptic. Oh, sorry, Martin, I think we lost him. Ah, yes, there are something, they are kind of like post-apocalyptic. Yes, they live as an effect of colonialism. And then maybe this new ontologist, to some extent, even if they have this kind of pretense to be anti-colonial, they really are a reactionary colonial in some strange way, because they didn't recognize this historical path here. Yes, for example, when you mention Siberia, we have the same effect. Yes, if we go to Siberia and we now, as an anthropologist, trying to think about this animes and people of Siberia, but there is almost the same as much long effect of colonialism, but the Russian one. Yes, and this is the question, yes, that maybe animism is, and then of course, because animism is based on oral communication, it is obvious that they cannot have macro categories, because this is a co-product of orality. If you don't write, you cannot abstract. Yes, this is a material approach to thinking. Yes, and yes, this is more like kind of a one big question about that they lost historical dimension. Yes, and if we go back to Ilienkov and maybe to Spinoza / Ilienkov, and we think that we are the way how matter thinking itself, yes, maybe this is that without that without this historical without this historical perspective, we cannot grasp this from the within of these societies. Yes, doesn't mean that the Amazonian societies are, underdeveloped or primitive or whatever. They just lost the way to grasp their own historical development, because without the writing, without the way to having dictionaries or archives or system of something, they lost this kind of a way to speak about their own history. And in this sense, we are connected and we are somehow part of their history, and we are guilty, we as a West. And then just one question, just aside. I am from Poland and I am from the village. I grew up in the village. My grandfather was almost illiterate, and the animist imagination is nothing exotic to me. Yes, when I was a child, it was like normal way of the village way of perceiving things without any fancy exotic travels. I have grasp of animism and this kind of imagination. It was like just a part of the material way of life, let's say, in the village. Yes, and for me this is like when I read this, let's say, I just put this because this is not Amazonian ontologies, but they constructed as it is. I really feel that something strange is happening there. Okay, sorry.
Thanks.
Was
Okay,
maybe
so if there's
follow-up.
anything, take anything you want from there, Martin. Don't feel you have to respond to everything.
Yes, well, there are different layers to all this. The historical variable is very important. I also draw on this in my book, that first of all, it is very difficult to find nowadays societies that still have this form of thinking. When I, as a student, first read these books, I then went to go to work with Amazon societies, and I was surprised that really there's little existing to nowadays of these forms of thinking, because now they are engaging in agriculture, they're producing coffee, cacao, they have now chickens and all kind of stuff. They have now radios. There are a ton of new things which obviously change their form of conceiving the world. So this kind of anthropology draws on a how you call it, maintained in history, some kind of society. This is a false way of thinking of these societies. And it is very interesting what you say, that these are some kind of post-apocalyptic societies, which is also true, because we know now, also I didn't mention it, but there are ways of overcoming, which Megas called the ecological limitations of the Amazon rainforest, with this terra preta, which is biochar, which is like a char in the Amazon soil, which permits that the soils are becoming more fertile. I'm actually now working on a project. We are recovering devastated areas in the Amazon with applying this pristine technique to the soils. So we know now that the societies of the Amazon nowadays are the product of a mass extinction of societies after the arriving of the Spanish, because of the, I don't know how you call it in English, viruela, the virus, who killed millions, more or less esteemed 50 million people in all the American continent. So it is true what you say, that these societies, we should somehow think of them as survivors of all these circumstances, colonialism, which in Peru is exactly the same as in Siberia or in Brazil, the Amazon was excluded. There were commercial relations between the Andes and the Amazon. And with the arriving of the Spanish, they cut all of these interactions, social interactions and cultural interactions with the Amazon, and practically forcefully, how you call it, put the Amazon in a kind of quarantine for like 300 years. And the societies nowadays of the Amazon are totally a product of this. And what people of the ontological turn are doing, I also think it's a kind of romanticization of the society, and then wanting to present them curiously as models for us to draw new political movements, decolonial movements, inspiring us by animism and all that. I also think that's pretty, yeah, it's a romanticization, it's a misconception of these societies, like they are really out of time, taken out of time. And what you just mentioned, I also think is very interesting. I also described in the book, because I make this reconceptualization of time and space in the antique and also the Middle Ages. I draw here on Gurevich. He's a Russian historian of the Middle Ages, and he also describes the conception of time in all agrarian societies, inclusive the agrarian societies of Poland, of Russia, still in the 19th and 20th century, where you have like this cyclical conception of time, which also we have in the Amazon. So it is not like the Amazons have come to a conception of time which is fundamentally different because they have thought philosophically different about these things. But if you live in a society where you make the same things as your father did, and your son will do the same things, and nothing really new happens, it's totally logical that you develop a conception of time which is cyclical, because there are no historical or political or technological circumstances which would allow you to grasp the idea of development, of progress, because it is really always the same thing. We have this inclusive in Plato. Plato's idea of knowledge is ideas, they have always been there. We just remember them. So nothing really fundamentally new happens in this world. And this is also, yeah, it's an, as you say, it's an anthropomorphic reality projected, and it is not, as these thinkers try to draw it, as like a conclusion Amazonian societies draw because they have gone into metaphysical conceptions about the world. It's just a natural, it is what you would expect them to think somehow.
Thanks. Okay, and Karina?
Yeah, just wanted to say that I think Ilyenkov is extremely important, and that's why this Martin's presentation is very important, because you quote from Levi Strauss, who says that there's this kind of tendency in Marxism, as he calls it, to derive thought immediately from practice. And of course, this tendency to just go straight from practice to thought is not Marxism. It's undialectical Marxism. It's crude materialism. And I think Levi Strauss was probably trying to counteract that. I'm not, and in a way, in his own way, I think Descolo was. They're trying to deal with aspects of the ideal. They're trying to counteract this crude materialism with structuralism and post-structuralism in order to try and interpret and understand what is the ideal, what is the formation of these ideologies and these not ideologies, but these forms of thought like animism and so on, with their own kind of Kantian, as you explained, the Kantian the pre-existing categories of thought. And as you, I think, brilliantly point out, they make them into eternal fixtures that, like the kaleidoscope, you're always mixing the same elements, but nothing can ever change because it's always the same kaleidoscope. And that's where Ilyenko, labor, Hegel come in with Hegel's understanding of the role of labor, and Ilyenko developing the ideal through this social labor, social being of the whole of humanity. I think that's where your interpretation is very powerful. Where also you mentioned Heidegger, where they mystify this social practice. They mystify it and they eternalize it and make it into a complete, very reactionary fixture. So yeah, it's this is where you quote from the Phenomenology by Hegel, which I thought was a very important point you made there. I would also add to that Hegel's Science of Logic is determinations of reflection, because we sort of think of reflection as being a passive, like you said, is thought being a passive thing, but for Hegel, it's not passive at all. It's actually, reflection is actually an active movement through negation, and it's not a direct, it's not, the thought does not come directly from the practice, or more advanced thought. It has to go through these different moments, which which is included in the human social practice. And I really like what you said about, I probably can't find it now. Sorry, I can't find it. At some point you may, I might remember it later. Anyway, that's it. Thank you, Martin. It's really, really
thank
good.
you. And I think it's very, very interesting and the most interesting point of Descolar's work. This is, he tries to overcome, as he himself states, the dualism in which the West is trapped since Descartes. And then he chooses exactly Kant to overcome this duality. Kant is also a totally dualistic thinker. And I think for this was Ilyenkov especially important for me, because with Ilyenkov, we really, that's why the book also is named Reconstruction of the Dialectic of the First and Second Nature, which is inspired in Hegel, but also in Ilyenkov, that we are nature that is thinking itself. I think dialectical thinking is important. And for me, the only way to construct a coherent monism, but not a mechanically, but a dialectical monism.
Thanks. Any final question for Martin before we wrap up and say thank you? Anyone who hasn't spoken?
Carl Finley's got a question.
Oh, great.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Martin. That was I really enjoyed that. I just had one question about one of the last things you said about being anthropomorphic or personhood elements in a higher abstraction or a higher category in some of these Western canon texts. I just wanted to ask if you could give a bit more on that, given the vital activity kind of paradigm. I just wanted to know is do you think that comes from the other side of this vital activity directly changing the ecology, or do you think it comes from a more, I don't know, like lost nostalgia for this change on equality with nature? Does it come from a direct material change in the ecology, or kind of the other side of the spectrum from the change, or is it a more ideal thing? Thanks.
Yeah, what I point out with this anthropomorphic principle also present in modern scientific views. I also make this reconstruction of some historical points. For example, Descartes, which is not necessarily ecological. I draw here also ultimately late a book that is very interesting by Preacher Jean, I think it's called. He makes this metaphor. We are engaging in a dialogue with nature. So in this dialogue over the history, we develop different kinds of languages with which we speak, so to say. From activity point of view, we engage in a certain kind of activity. And this kind of activity, which is obviously culturally and historically constructed, determines the way we conceive nature. So I draw here on Boris Hessen. Boris Hessen, which you certainly all know, he describes how really Newton and also Descartes develop this kind of conception of the world as basically a machine. And this is obviously the result of that in this particular time of them, the society as a whole, the vital activity of the Western society starts to depend more and more on the application of these machines. And we engage with nature throughout these machines. So our conception as nature as a machine is in this kind, it's not because the nature is a machine, but we now can receive certain information from nature throughout this interaction, so that makes us think that nature really is like that. So, and we then judge nature, which we got to know throughout this socially constructed interaction with it, historically formed interaction, and then judge it as if it is like that all the time. We then say nature is like a machine. So this is some kind of anthropomorphic conception. The same for Darwin. Darwin, we have certain developments in our society. He then engages also in the study of nature. He identifies certain mechanisms which are analogous to the concept, the dynamics in our own society. He then judges the natural life in terms of our social life, so to speak, and then claims nature is like that. So we judge natural processes in terms of our social life, and then absolutize them, and then that's some kind of anthropomorphic. I mean, I think a very strong anthropomorphic metaphor, which is very prominent nowadays, for example, in the era of artificial intelligence and all that, is that our brain or the mind is like computational system. This is also totally anthropomorphic. It is not like that. It is totally different. But it is a anthropomorphic conception, but which passes in the academia as it were a totally scientific view of the mind. I don't think if this explains it.
Right. Thank you very much, Martin. Really stimulating discussion. I'm glad, we've been able to probe deep here. Excellent questions from everyone as well. So please do, after this, send Martin the message separately. If you're a Spanish speaker, I do hope you purchase the book, which sounds fascinating and very novel. Thank you for your time, Martin. Back to Corinna.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Thank you, everybody. Lots of good comments in the chat, and we can share that later on the email list. Is everybody here on the email list? If you're not, you can just put your email in the